Welcome to the Book of Urm, Chapter 11, Devilkin. Devilkin. Serpentis Endium, master merchant of Coast Haven, Canoniah let fall the remaining bones of his cooked rodent into the fire, licked his fingers. The dinner Piecora cooked for them tonight was especially tasty and full of spice. He stared unblinking into the flames. Of all the strange encounters of the day, his mind still lingered on the terrible vision from the lake. He briefly looked up at the night sky and saw the infinite curtain of familiar stars glinting behind a waving ribbon of blue and teal aurora. Reaching back into his academia, he guessed from the stars that he was facing south toward the lake, and he deduced that their travels would continue south until they reached Cynthia. The lake still remained between them and their destination, but that was a problem for tomorrow. Then he saw Alba Meluna, the white moon, nearly a quarter full and rising into the blue-green aurora's ether. Neither of the other moons were present, which was completely fine with him. For once, he thought, a good omen watches over us in the sky. He looked at his three companions and said, "One should be so lucky to have such friends as thus," gesturing with a flick of his hand, smiling weakly. "You were in quite a state when we pulled you from the water," Piecora said finally. "A madness came over you, and you coughed up words as well as water. What were their meanings? What did you see?" A long pause hung in the air, broken only by the flickering flames and the night's chorus of chirps and squeals, fluttering wings, and the occasional splash from the nearby lake. They had a distance between them and the lake when they searched for a place to bed down, but it remained within earshot. "It was a terrible dream," he began slowly, and he recounted his vision to his companions as best as he could. When he finished, a pall of brooding quiet fell over their camp, as if the forest itself had stopped what it was doing to listen to his account. Karui broke the silence, speaking slowly and quietly. "You saw the end of the kindred war that occurred many ages ago, long before the coming of the Southrons from across the sea and the founding of Canoniah, and even before the founding of Sienia. It was a conflict between Cynthia and a small nation of humans called the Hyolangorn. They were eradicated by the Eldar, and after the war, Cynthia shut itself from the world." "What was the nature of this conflict?" Serpentis asked, grappling with how real everything felt in his vision. Karui answered, "We, the Banwa, do not know. It is an ancient tale, lost to us over the years, and the Banwa do not keep written records. Our history is spoken through generations by speakers, singers, and shamans of the spirits. They live in our songs, our symbols, and our Silagan markings. If you want a true account of the past, especially of the war, you will find it in Aeonwyrm, the city on the hill of Gorai. But that is the problem. They haven't left since the war, and no one is allowed to enter. That is, even if they survive the encircling forest. They have removed themselves from the world. Vioyen, their queen, still sleeps to this day inside the mother tree since the war ended." Serpentis tried to comprehend how old the Cynthian queen must be if she was alive during this ancient kindred war which took place before his own people came to these shores from across the vast salt sea. "Gods!" he muttered to himself, feeling fatigue taking over. Suddenly they all heard soft footfalls nearby, approaching the camp. Karui was on her feet instantly. She barked something in Banwaris while pointing her hand. Outside of the firelight, appearing in the darkness, came the violet-glowing panther Siru, crouching and stalking. "No! Don't hurt us! Gods, no!" a young male called out, in perfectly familiar low Canonian common. Serpentis detected a Muthan accent. Serpendis slowly stood up, his knees cracking and the base of his spine aching. There in the darkness, barely lit by the violet glow from Siru, two figures crouched before the panther spirit. Hero launched from the grass and flew at the intruders in zigzag attack vectors, buzzing just above their heads with his exposed talons capable of rending flesh. A high-pitched squeal, sounding like it came from a young girl, escaped from one of the figures as Hero flew just past her ear. "Wait," said Serpendis. "Stay your pets. Let me speak to them." Karui spat untranslatable Banwarese at him. Piecora said, "She's not having any of it. We're in the Fey realm. Nothing can be trusted. Or haven't you learned that by now?" She drew an arrow from her quiver, knocked it against her bowstring, then pulled the bow all the way back, muscles tensing in her shoulder and arm. There was a ripping sound, followed by the male crying out in pain. Serpendis ran in front of Piecora and Karui, waving his hands. "Let me speak to them," he shouted, with surprising strength in his voice, his words coming faster than he understood them. "If we just attack everything, then we don't deserve to live here. Let the Fae come and consume us all." He wasn't even certain if he made any sense in that moment, but something spurred him to take action and interrupt how things were quickly developing. Hero drew away from the huddled couple, and Siru laid down in the grass, still ready to pounce. Serpendis stood straight and half-turning back to Piecora and Karui, he said, "If they attack me, then you can save my neck like you always do, but I think there is more to this boy." The accent gives him away that he is not some fey trickery plucked from our minds. Piecora and Karui exchanged perplexed glances, but stayed poised for action. Piecora relaxed her bowstring. Serpendis strode to the other side of the fire, just within Karui's smoldering defensive ring, etched into the grass. He put his hands on his hips, like a teacher addressing a class, and called into the night. "Boy, girl, come closer, let me see you," he said, and then rubbed his aching lower back with his hands. Slowly the two strangers emerged from the darkness as the firelight revealed their faces. Both were very strange to Piecora and Karui. The two friends glanced at each other again with worried looks. The boy's face was human-like, but angular, and pointed with broad cheekbones, a sharp chin, and sharp teeth, meant for tearing flesh. His brow kept his eyes in darkness, except for the soft, eerie, reflective glow from the fire like two small mirrors. His skin was pale, pink in his joints, eyes, nose, and ears, and pulled taut over his muscles and bones. His long, pointed tongue flicked out unexpectedly. Growing from his hairline were two ivory horns like those of a young ram, curling back through his black, messy hair. Their color at their base was the same color as his skin, pale and pink, then tapering to shiny black points. He wore a dark tunic the color of soot, and gray loose trousers that clung to his hips by a piece of shipping twine succumbed to mildew from long years at sea. He was barefoot, and his hands and feet were long, as were his toes and fingers, from which grew black and broken nails. At the base of the boy's spine, poking through a torn hole in his loose breeches, was a long, whip-like tail that moved fluidly from side to side. Its color ranged from pale pink at its base, like the boy's skin color, to black, like the ends of his curled horns. At the end of the tail was a sharp barb, like a spear. Part of his tunic was torn completely off, and Serpendis saw that the boy's exposed shoulder was bleeding heavily from a deep, fresh wound. The girl had almost white skin, with long blonde hair, large black eyes, and full lips that shifted from side to side as if her nose itched. She wore only a long cotton nightshirt, drenched and soaked through. Her hands were small, and instead of feet, she had hooves, and her bare-skinned, lower legs and ankles were bent in the ways of a creature's hind legs, only without any fur. They both came toward the fire, cowering before Serpendis. Serpendis spoke quickly. "I can only buy you so much time before these two have it their way. And you, sir, have to get that wound taken care of before this world infects it. So be quick with your words. Tell me who you are and what you're doing here." The boy answered, looking up at Serpendis. "My lord, sir, we mean no harm to anyone. We are trying to get out of this place, wherever this is. I don't even know how I got here. What is your name, and where do you come from?" Serpendis cut in. He felt like at any moment Piecora would end this boy's life. As his eyes flashed again in the firelight, Serpendis noticed that the boy had the pupils of a goat. "Vinexi, I'm from Coast Haven," the boy stammered. Serpendis now guessed that the boy was probably in his mid to late teens. He wasn't sure about the girl yet. "You think me a fool, Unscavian?" Serpendis replied. "I can smell the stink of your accent anywhere, even in this God's-forsaken place." "My lord, Don't kill us." "How long since you were smuggled out of Muth, Devilkin?" Serpendis interrogated. Piecora and Karui exchanged another glance with each other, unsure of what to make of what they were hearing. Vinexi sat on his haunches and pulled his knees back, running his hands through his bedraggled hair and over his horns. The girl threw her arms around him and moved behind him for protection. Days, weeks, you know what I am?" Vinexi asked weakly. "I know what you are," Serpendis said, his voice softening. "You are Unscavian, the people who live sequestered in the Eindungzirk district of Norschland, otherwise called the Contained, where Mendilshus Newman and every ruler before him have kept you hidden from the world's view." He scoffed and then spat. "Eindungzirk, so much more than a personal playground for elites like his Chancellor Veklische." Briefly, memories from his past crept over him before he pushed them away to focus on the here and now. He grunted with age as he sat down cross-legged in front of the fire, facing the two youths. "Now then, who's the girl?" Serpendis asked. Vinexi shifted his strange eyes and said nervously, "I'd rather not say, for her safety." "Her safety depends on you answering my questions. Was she smuggled with you? She's not your kind, and she doesn't seem like the kind you'd meet in Coast Haven," Serpendis remarked. Her skin was too smooth, too clean, and too pure for Coast Havener life. He was certain that she was some sort of royalty, but had no idea who she belonged to, and the issue with her legs and hooved feet perplexed him too. "Alice," said Vinexi, "she hasn't spoken since I found her here." "You met her here?" Serpendis asked. We left Muth together, and we arrived in Coast Haven." "Ah, so you're together. Let me guess, Ralton took you in?" "Yes, the book dealer took us in, and then we were off." Serpendis laughed heartily, then tried to remember when he last felt such mirth. "Book dealer. Ah, my boy, he is more than that." "Well, I don't remember much after that," Vinexi said. "We were hidden in a cart beneath a tapestry for a long time. I remember being on a boat. I think we crossed a large river, and then back on land, hard cobbled roads. Then it was quieter, softer. After many days, weeks perhaps, I lost count, we finally stopped. There were discussions around the cart in another language. They sounded like elves, if you can believe that. I had never heard such lyrical speech before." "Ah, you went to Amedia," Serpendis said. "Elves of the blue moors of Amedia. Beautiful people. I loved buying trinkets from them and turning them around in Coast Haven for double the coin." He laughed, looking back at his two companions. Both were still rigid and ready for a fight at any moment. Serpendis motioned with one hand for them to stand down and relax. He then cleared his throat and became serious again, turning back to Vinexi and Alice. Roltin, the old sot, arranged to have you transferred across the Angriluin River to the realm of Erendor, probably docking at the town of Thistle. There, I guess, you headed south on the Westmere toward Dolgethad, where the road is well maintained. But instead of going to the city, you turned left, off the road, maybe around Edgewood, and went across farmlands, passing towns like Veligre and Humil, where I have relatives. You kept going west and north over the Shadow Moors, probably had to defend yourselves against wolves, goblins, or thieves, until you made it to the very western edge of Canania, where just beyond are the Blue Moors and the Elves of Amedia. I'd bet next year's profits on it. Well, maybe you're right, Venexi continued. I don't know anything about these lands. One night, Alice and I decided to leave the cart and look around. We were stuck inside the cart for so long, and we were sore and cramped, and that was after hiding in the bilge of the Muthen ship for weeks when we escaped. To see the hills for the first time, and to fill our lungs with fresh air, and the village there, the elven village. I had never seen elves before. We hid and ran to the outskirts onto one of the highest hills where we found a pool surrounded by standing stones, Serpentis said, rolling his eyes. Why do I think I know the rest of this story? He said to no one in particular. We ran up the hill to the pool, and we slept under the stars behind one of the large stones. It was the first moment we had just to ourselves, and our first taste of freedom. I will never forget that night. We awoke in the morning to the sun rising in the east, and suddenly the hill was alight with bright blue flowers. Hence the name the Blue Moors, said Serpentis, shrugging his shoulders. Every morning it happens as the sun first appears in the west across the Angriluin. It lasts only for several minutes until the sun disappears behind the clouds that always shroud the sleepless hills. Then the flowers die, only to bloom again the following morning. No one knows why. Higher Signese they're called blue fire flowers. Venexi paused for a few moments before continuing. Elves came to the pool, I think to worship or something. They were singing with deep voices. I felt sadness in their song, and I wondered why. Why, in such a beautiful place, could they be mourning? And what could they be mourning for? They spotted us, and in my panic, I dove into the pool. It was deeper than I expected, and I went as far as I could until my lungs were about to burst. When I reached the surface, I was in this strange place. I wandered for hours, looking for Alice until I came to this lake, and then she appeared to me soaking wet, as if she had just come through herself. She pointed at the lake, indicating that's where she came from, and that's where she'll take us away from this place, back to Canania. But I'm exhausted, and I need to rest. We'll go in the morning. He patted her hand consolingly, but she still looked terrified. What of her feet? Her legs? Serpentis asked. What happened to her? Venexi looked at her, then back to Serpentis, trying to find words. This place, it's affected her. I don't feel any different, but Alice changed. She can't speak, and her legs, her feet. What has happened to her? Venexi rubbed Alice's feet with his hands. Serpentis stood up slowly, feeling his bones cracking. Come into the fire with us, and let us look at your wound. He turned to Piecora and Karui and said, You heard him. They're trapped here like us, and I know a thing or two more about their troubles, perhaps more than they might expect. Would you look into his wound? Can we give them food? Piecora and Karui looked at each other without speaking, and Karui slowly looked back at the two interlopers. Inpa, she said curtly, stepping forward. Venexi and Alice crept forward hand in hand, but as Venexi crossed the ring of embers surrounding the camp, Alice stopped, shaking her head from side to side, as if something frightened her. Come on, love. They'll take care of us. We can be gone from this place in the morning, Venexi said, trying to pull her with him. But she would not budge. digging her hooves into the soft grass and soil. She started to wail, which caught the attention of the others. "What is wrong with you, darling? Come on," Vinexi opined. Serpendis came over to him and laid a hand on Vinexi's uninjured shoulder. "Let her be, lad. Give her time. That one frightens me, too, even to this day," he said, nodding at Piecora. "We need to get you looked at." Vinexi let go of Alice and allowed himself to be led to the fire. Alice went running back into the darkness. Piecora knelt and inspected the wound, and then went rummaging through her pack as well as Karui's. Karui, however, strode over to the edge of the ring and watched Alice. Alice recoiled away, and Siru followed her. She crept across the field of grass until she reached the tree line where they emerged earlier and disappeared. Siru stopped just short of the trees, sat down, and waited. Serpendis sat down and watched his two companions. Hiero was nowhere in sight. Then Karui turned and said, "That girl isn't who or what she says she is. The male youth is a fool," while placing a large leaf covered in ground herbs and cream on Vinexi's shoulder. Vinexi curled his lip at the strong vinegar smell from the poultice, then winced when it touched his shoulder. "Hold still. This medicine isn't gentle, but it will sew you back up by tomorrow," Piecora said. Serpendis looked beyond Karui into the night where his eyes couldn't see, for he lacked the vision of the elves. "Is she gone?" he asked. Karui shook her head. "Just within the nearby trees, she watches," she said, while wrapping the boy's shoulder in cloth. "She's afraid of you," said Vinexi, looking back over his wounded shoulder at Piecora. "She should be," Piecora replied before standing up and putting away their medicinals. Vinexi stood up, rolling his hurt shoulder and picking at the cloth tied around it. He stood next to Karui and called out, "Alice, come! They won't harm you. I'm here." Karui watched him dispassionately, then turned back to the fire while muttering something to herself. "Lad, listen," Serpendis began, walking over to him. "She's near enough that if anything happens to her, we're here. I wouldn't go to her. It's safest here, near the fire. Trust me on that. I want you to contemplate something." He turned to face Vinexi. "Why hasn't she spoken since you found her? And what happened to her feet? And why can't she come near the fire? Why does she watch us now from the trees? You see that cat over there, made of light? He protects us, and he can tell if something isn't right. So can our Banwa friend. We are within her protection as long as we are near the fire. So why such a reaction from her?" He reached out to Vinexi's arm. "Come, let's get some sleep, and we can hash all this out in the morning. Think about what I said to you, though. There are many things in this world that are strange to us, even to Canonians who think we have all the answers to everything. Nothing shows you how ignorant you really are more than a trip across the wild lands. And I've done it twice now." Serpendis awoke as he usually did, on his side, with his left arm completely numb beneath his head, bent at the elbow with his bony hand hovering over his face. As his vision came into focus, he saw the familiar wall of mist around them and the remnants of the small fire in their midst. Piecora was folding her bedroll, and Karui was seated with her legs crossed in meditation. Hiero stood in the middle of Piecora's folding and packing, playfully hopping around her movements and managing to stay out of the way while also being in the way. Serpendis watched them for a while as they moved in detached symbiosis. Then he remembered the Devilkin boy and the strange girl from last night, and he sat up quickly, surveying the camp. Vinexi was anxiously pacing back and forth at the edge of the camp, just before the wall of mist. He rubbed his wounded shoulder until he couldn't take it anymore, tearing the cloth off and throwing the poultice down. But then he saw with disbelief that his wound was nearly healed, with only some mild bruising and discoloration. "I wouldn't leave the camp right now," Serpendis warned, "especially now. Let the mist clear first, then we can see what's around us and decide what to do." "What about Alice?" Venexi asked, his voice filled with concern. "She's still out there. We are betrothed, and I'm not out there with her." Serpendis got up slowly, wiping away dust and leaves from his robe and smoothing out the wrinkles. "Lad, did you think on anything I said last night?" "I don't care. You're wrong," Venexi cried, and he turned to leap into the mist. But Piecora grabbed his arm and pulled hard, and Venexi fell to the ground at her feet. Serpendis quickly knelt beside him and pressed his hand to Venexi's chest. "Don't get up! Don't be a fool!" Then he pointed harshly toward the mist. "If you go out there, you'll be gone. You'll be lost. Only Hero can leave as he wishes because the forest grants him a free pass. But not us. If you leave, your Alice will never see you again. I promise you that. And let's hope she's still with us." Serpendis noticed a change overcome Venexi's face. His eyes were fixated on something in the mist. Turning, Serpendis saw that the mist began to lift, and through the thin, trailing wisps, a white horse emerged with a flowing white mane and long white tail. It was the most majestic horse he had ever seen in his life, and it stole his breath away. The horse stood midway between the camp and the forest, watching them as it lowered its head to nibble on grass and shifted its massive weight on its slender hooves. It raised its head and nodded while snorting playfully, beckoning to them. "Alice?" said Venexi, slowly rising to his feet. He stood dumbfounded, convinced that the horse was his love. Serpendis also felt a strange allure from the horse. "Look, there are others," said Piecora, pointing toward the forest. Out from the trees came 3 other magnificent horses, rivaling even the finest Sienyan horses. One was light auburn in color with dark brown legs and hocks. Another was light gray with black dappling on its hindquarters and a white stripe on its head. The third was pale pink and purple fractal patterns similar to Karui's skin. "One for each of us," said Serpendis quietly, dumbstruck, as he stared particularly at the light gray steed. Venexi turned around and said, "She must have made friends. She brought others to take us all back home." He stepped out of the camp just as the final wisps of morning mist were trailing into the sky, and he called out to the white horse while opening his arms wide. "You've always put others before yourself. This is why I love you." Something about all of this did not seem right to Serpendis, but he found himself stepping away from camp as well, feeling most drawn to the light gray horse. "My love, take us home," he heard Venexi say nearby. He tore his gaze away from the gray horse to find Venexi embracing the white horse's large, powerful neck. The horse was calm, gentle, and fidgeted endearingly with Venexi's hair with its nose and lips. Venexi went to the side of the horse and swung his leg up and over the back of the horse, gripping the horse's mane to help lift the rest of him up. Serpendis swooned, feeling the urge to avert his gaze and look back upon the gray horse. But there was something about Venexi that bothered him. Venexi did not sit up. Rather, he stayed lying flat on the horse's back with his head turned to the side. He made eye contact with Serpendis and tried to lift his head, tried to move his arms. Venexi's face turned to anguish, and Serpendis saw his lips move to the words, "Help me!" Abruptly, the white horse broke into a full gallop toward the lake with enough force to dismount any rider not otherwise joined to the horse in the way that Venexi was. Vynexi lay plastered on the back of the horse and moved with the horse's great muscles as it bolted off, kicking up large tufts of soil and grass. Serpentis heard thundering hooves advancing. Whirling to face them, he saw the other 3 horses rushing toward each of them, the grey one coming straight at him. Instead of cowering or running, he stood muted, naked in mind and heart, frozen in his place. A light whistle whizzed by his right ear. The grey horse suddenly reared back and threw its forelegs high into the air, bellowing an excruciating shriek as an arrow of black and yellow fletching pierced its eye. It lost control of its momentum and crashed into the turf, head forward, flipping over and landing with its full weight on its side with a tremendous thump that shook the ground beneath Serpentis's feet. Its legs kicked and flailed as it groaned loudly from the fall. Serpentis was immediately pulled out of his stupor and braced for anything while looking around for the rest of his companions. Piecora and her Sienyan bow stood motionless within the camp like a Durin-Laden sculpture of Artemis as she loosed another arrow, this time at the rear flank of the white horse. Karui was outside of the camp between Serpentis and the lake. Her feet were wide apart, and her arms hung low and straight, with sinewy muscles flexing in her shoulders, biceps, and forearms. Her hands curled at the wrist, palms up, as if lifting a heavy object from the ground. Serpentis felt another rumble in his feet, this time more protracted and further away. To his left, the grass detonated in a cloud of soil and debris as wild, ropey vines leapt from the ground and caught the pink and purple mottled horse's legs. It went down hard in mid-charge, snapping several bones in its massive legs. Another arrow punctured the flank of the white horse, then another into the large neck just above Vynexi's hand. The white horse stumbled and fell awkwardly, sliding head-first into the lake. It came to a stop in the mud midway beneath the water, kicking and flailing with Vynexi pasted onto its back. Serpentis saw the auburn horse leap into the camp at Piecora, but as it passed over Karui's ring of embers, its body caught fire and burned, as if entering a red-hot kiln. Piecora ducked and rolled to the side, drawing her hatchet. While the flaming horse was airborne, Hero zipped in low to the ground as if tied to a string, rising up at the last moment to sink his talons into the horse's muscular neck. Hero beat his wings hard, while gripping as much meat as he could before disengaging. Chunks of flesh from the horse's neck flew in the air as it crashed on its side and slid to the edge of the camp. Hero, flying at dizzying speed, buzzed past Serpentis and banked hard right, flinging mangled meat away. He then arced straight up, closed his wings, and acrobatically spun completely around to execute another attack on the burning horse. Serpentis heard the roar from a large cat, and turning toward the immobilized pink and purple horse, he saw Siru fully engaged in battle with it. He watched it leap and pounce onto the large horse, easily twice its own size. The horse opened its mouth far wider than a typical horse's anatomy would allow and engulfed Siru's neck. Siru dug all 4 of his large claws into the hide of the fallen horse. Vines whipped violently around the horse's neck and body, squeezing and crushing the life out of it as the horse continued kicking violently. Siru flailed against the horse's horrific maw around his neck as the fight continued without the grunts or roars or shrieks from either creature, just the whipping of tendrils, the commotion of tossed earth and mud, and the trembling of the ground. Piecora ran toward the white horse with her hatchet, and so too did Karui. Serpentis blinked wildly and joined them at the flailing white horse in the water, with Vynexi flat on its back, realizing the dire peril Vynexi was in. The horse, its massive head and neck fully submerged, was trying to drag the rest of itself into the lake, but it had lost the use of its hind legs. Serpentis knew they only had moments to save Vynexi from drowning. All three converged on the horse in the lake's shallows. The sound of its kicking and writhing and splashing filled their ears. Piecora yelled, "Don't touch it! While it still lives, we will be stuck to it and dragged into the lake." Piecora threw herself into the water. Karui made another gesture with her hands, and more vines, tendrils, and fungal mycelia exploded from the mud. Lilies and colorful lake flowers suddenly became violently animated, and their stalks and stems grew as thick as Serpendis's own arm. They wrapped around the horse's hind legs and hooves and pulled taut, anchoring the horse's hind quarters. If it rolls over on its back, Venexi is gone, he thought to himself. Without thinking, he found himself rushing into the water. The water was icy cold on his skinny legs. The horse flailed and rolled onto its left side. Piecora charged the horse's exposed belly with her antlers while swinging the hatchet in a wide arc with all of her strength. The antlers punctured the horse's soft underside, then raked upwards, flinging flesh high into the air as her hatchet cleaved into the perforated belly, cutting sideways and opening a terrible wound into the horse. The turbulent water around Piecora immediately went black. Serpendis waded to the left side where Venexi lay fused on the horse's back, gulping air each time his head lifted above the roiling water's surface. The monster was no longer a horse or even horse-like. From the guttural, waterlogged, nauseating sounds it made to how wildly it thrashed about, no horse that Serpendis knew had muscles that could move in the way that this thing did. It disturbed him how its legs bent at odd angles and twisted its head all the way around. Now that he was so close to it, he could see that its fur was not fur at all, but a fleshy moss, or a thick mold that behaved like fur to someone's eyes from a distance. Yet another creature with trickery and disguise, thought Serpendis. Venexi strained his head to look at Serpendis with wild fear in his eyes as he lay helplessly against the creature's enormous back. Seeing the size and mass of the creature up close, Serpendis realized it could easily kill all three of them at once if exhaustion hadn't yet taken its toll. As the horse flailed and slowly slipped through the vines around its hind quarters, creeping further into the lake, Serpendis knew they were now out of time. "Piecora!" he shouted over the monster. "Throw me the shell!" He made hand gestures around his face. "The shell! Throw it to me!" Piecora reached down to her belt, quickly unclasped the mollusk breather, and threw it over the beast to Serpendis. Catching the strange device, Serpendis grabbed back of Venexi's head and pulled, but it wouldn't budge from the back of the beast. So he pushed the mollusk onto Venexi's face and shouted into his ear, "Breathe." Just then, the creature broke from the vines and lurched forward out of the shallows, dragging Venexi and Serpendis with it beneath the waves. Serpendis's last look above the water was back at the creature's hind legs. They had shrunk into the legs of the girl from the night before. That was how it slipped from Karui's grasp. Now beneath the water and holding on to Venexi, he kept the breather on Venexi as the shell's exposed gills sprang into life, fanning out and turning a vibrant, veiny, oxygenated red. Serpendis held out one finger in front of Venexi's terrified face, then two, then three, as if counting down. When he reached his thumb, he removed the breather and used the device on himself for a few breaths. Then he pushed it back on Venexi's face while holding his own breath. As they did this a few times, Serpendis realized he was no longer standing in soft mud, but drifting weightlessly downward. Looking down, he found himself gazing into the void of the lake's black, unknown depths. "Gods! My gods!" was all he could muster in his stupefied thoughts, being filled with both terror and wonder simultaneously. He felt the body of the huge beast suddenly convulse. Looking to his side, he found Piecora straddling the monster's belly, her legs stuck to its skin, like Venexi was. She had the hatchet dug into the monster's deep wound, pushing forward all the way to her wrists. Her eyes were wide open with unbridled fury, and from her bared teeth spouted streams of bubbles on both sides of her mouth, trailing behind her. Tendons in her neck and veins in her forehead indicated the primal rage of her Sienyan spirit. Her braided hair floated around her head as a depiction of an otherworldly sea demon from the abyss. The monster lurched again as its belly wound split wide open and disemboweled, spewing black clouds around Piecora. The monster became still and listed further over with its belly above, and Venexi and Serpendis caught underneath. Then Venexi's body separated from the horse's back. A plume of air bubbles billowed from the creature's unhinged jaws and wide-open nostrils. Serpendis quickly gathered Venexi from behind by wrapping his arms across Venexi's chest. He pressed the breathing mollusk onto Venexi's face and held his own breath. As Serpendis kicked upward, they both watched the body of the monster slowly fall into the darkness below, trailing ichor from its disemboweled stomach as it concluded its transformation back into the young girl that had seduced Venexi the previous day. Breaking the water's surface, he found Piecora treading water with him. Her deadly antlers still held prominently on her head, and her dark braids framed her tanned face and dark eyes. A face had become quintessentially Sienyan to him. She took Venexi from him, strapped the breather fully onto his face, and swam toward the shore. There, he saw Karui wading into the shallows, waving to them, and he realized that they were out much further than he imagined. Exhausted, but still enjoying the supernatural vitality that the realm of the Fae somehow provided him, he put his head down and swam after Piecora and Venexi. Thank you for listening to this chapter from the Book of Urm. If you enjoyed this reading, like and subscribe to our channel, and consider supporting us at the Book of Urm at patreon.com.